Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Maple Grove Scripture Reading Podcast. So we are still in Job chapter 31, still working through Job's final defense before God. He's been laying his life open in these series of oaths. You know, if I've done any of these things, here's the punishment that I accept. Eyes, adultery, servants, the poor, the widow, the fatherless, idolatry, wealth worship. He's been covering every corner of his life, every category of moral failure that might explain why God has allowed all of this to happen to him. So last time we were in verses 24 through 28, where Job swore that he never put his trust in gold, never let wealth be the thing that he called his security or found his satisfaction in. And then he turned to the sky and swore that he never looked at the sun or the moon with a worshipful heart, never let his wonder stop at the creation rather than passing through it to the Creator. Both oaths were about the same root failure, taking the needs that belong to God, like where do you find safety, where does your awe go, and then handing them to something that God had made instead. Today we're in verses 29 through 34. And this cluster covers how Job treated his enemies, what his household looked like for strangers, and then something that's a little different from everything else in the chapter, whether Job ever hid who he really was because he was afraid what people would think. So let me read through Job 31, 29 through 34. If I have rejoiced at my enemy's misfortune or gloated over the trouble that came to him, I have not allowed my mouth to sin by invoking a curse against their life. If those of my household have never said who has not been filled with Job's meat, but no stranger had to spend the night in the street, for my door was always open to the traveler. If I have concealed my sin as people do by hiding my guilt in my heart because I so feared the crowd and so dreaded the contempt of the clans that I kept silent and would not go outside. So the passage opens with Job's enemies, and the specific thing he disclaims here is not unusual to hear. Don't rejoice when your enemy falls. We know that from Proverbs 24:17. It's a standard piece of wisdom literature ethics. But notice that Job doesn't just say that he never rejoiced at their misfortune. He goes further in verse 30 and says he never allowed his mouth to invoke a curse against their life. He hasn't just avoided the emotion, he's held his tongue deliberately. Even when somebody who has been against him was suffering, Job didn't let himself say the thing that he might have had the right to say. He didn't call it down on them. He held the restraint all the way through to his speech. In the ancient world, this was countercultural in a way that's hard to overstate. Cursing your enemies was not just permitted, it was often expected. The idea that a powerful man with real enemies would watch those enemies fall and simply not say anything about it, not celebrate, not even whisper a curse, that was unusual. Job is claiming he did exactly that. And he's making that claim right now, in the middle of a long speech in which he has enemies. His three friends have accused him repeatedly. They've been against him in the deepest sense. They've attributed in him hidden sin. They've implied that his suffering is justice. They've refused to believe him. And Job hasn't cursed them. He's been angry. He's been pretty blunt, but he hasn't cursed them. The oath he's making here isn't just historical. It's what's happening like right now. Now, verses 31 and 32 shift to hospitality, and they do it with a pretty unusual structure. Most of Job's oaths follow the if I've done wrong pattern. Well, these two verses break that pattern and make a positive claim instead. The same thing verse 18 did when Job said he raised the fatherless as a father from his youth. Here he says, ask my household, ask the people who ate at my table whether anybody went hungry. And the rhetorical question his household would have asked is what it said in the passage, who has not been filled with the meat of Job? It implies that the answer is nobody, that everyone ate. There was always enough. The table was full and open. And then the specific claim about strangers. No one had to sleep in the street. His door was always open to the traveler. In the ancient Near East, hospitality to strangers was a serious moral obligation, not just a nicety, but a duty rooted in the understanding that a traveler without shelter was genuinely at risk. You have the desert and the dark, the exposed road. Being left outside wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. A man with resources and a closed door wasn't just inhospitable, he was negligent. possibly culpable. And Job says, well, that was never my house. The door was always open. The traveler never slept in the street, and his own household can testify to it. What's interesting is that these positive claims from the household's testimony about the open door, they come right at the center of this passage. It's sandwiched between the enemy oaths and the hidden sin oaths. There's a portrait being built here of a person whose private life matched his public reputation. The people who lived with him and ate with him and watched him every day, they weren't seeing a different man than the one that he claimed to be. And then in verses 33 and 34, everything shifts. Every other oath in this chapter has been about Job's conduct toward other people, what he did or didn't do, how he treated servants and enemies and strangers and the poor. But this one is about his conduct toward himself, specifically whether he performed innocence while hiding guilt. He says, if I have concealed my sin as people do by hiding guilt in my heart. The NIV translates the Hebrew here as people do. It's a general statement about the human pattern of covering up wrongdoing. Other translations read it as Adam did, and the Hebrew word is more ambiguous between the proper name Adam or just the generic word for humanity. They're the same, Adam. But either reading lands in the same place. There's an archetype human pattern of hiding sin, covering it up, burying it, refusing to bring it to the light. But Job says he never did that. He never hid his guilt in his heart behind a face of innocence. And then verse 34 names the reason that people do that. It's fear. He so feared the crowd, so dreaded the contempt of the clans that he kept silent and wouldn't go outside. It's a specific picture. It's the person who knows something true about himself that contradicts the public image and who stays in physically, emotionally, conversationally because the cost of being known accurately is too high. The crowd's opinion becomes the thing that shapes what you're willing to say and what you're willing to keep buried. Silence becomes a survival strategy. Reputation management becomes a second life you have to maintain. Most people recognize the pattern from the inside. The thing you haven't said out loud because, well, you're not sure how it would land. Or the failure that you've kept quiet because the version of you that people believe in is easier to live inside than the real one. Well, Job says he was never that person. He never let what the crowd might think determine what he was willing to put on the record about himself. The irony of where this oath falls in this chapter is hard to miss. Job's friends have spent an enormous energy trying to get him to confess. The logic of their theology requires hidden sin. They've been in the crowd, in a sense, the gathered voices of conventional wisdom, pressing Job to admit what they're sure must be true. And Job has refused. He's gone outside. He's made his case openly. He's done the exact opposite of hiding. So when he says in verse 34 that he never kept silent and would not go outside of fear of the crowd, well, it's not just, again, a historical claim about how he lived before. It describes what he's doing right now in the moment with this speech. He's not staying inside. He's not letting the contempt of the clans drive him to a false confession. He's standing in the open and speaking. The whole chapter's been building toward something. We're almost there. The final section, which we're going to get to next time, is where Job takes everything that he's sworn and asks God to answer him. He's not going to hide. He's going to sign his name to it. All right, so next time we will be in verses 35 through 40. It's going to be the end of the chapter and the end of Job's words. He's going to sign his defense like a legal brief and demand that God respond. And then those final words, the words of Job, are ended. And it's definitely one of the most loaded closing lines in the book. All right, we'll leave it there. Hope you have a great day, and we'll talk again soon. God bless.